On the 23rd of July 2020 marked the 50th anniversary since the Education for Handicapped Children Act 1970 was introduced, an act to make provision as respects to England and Wales for discontinuing the classification of handicapped children as unsuitable for education at school and for the purpose connected therewith, meaning from the 23rd of July 1970, all children of compulsory school age had a right to an education. We do not use the term handicap today, but this was still being used in 1970. The audio is playing from a school isolation booth. School isolation booths are sometimes used as a form of punishment for disruptive behaviour. Before the pandemic, discussions about their usage in schools was being spoken about in the wider media. The idea is to explore the feeling of isolation and intimacy in the space. I would like to commemorate the Act by asking you, 50 years on, how inclusive do you feel the education system is today, or when you were at school, and what would your ideal school look like?
When you are in school, it really sticks with you for a very long time that you want to be able to have the same opportunities as everyone else, but you are told that if your reading and writing doesn't improve, you'll amount to nothing, and you believe it. And there's so much focus on you can't do this, you can't do that. It would be great if I heard the word can't, but without the T for some reason. I hated it. And teachers have this habit of sugarcoating things, saying, oh, we don't think about how different we are anymore because everyone's all nice and we're all very sympathetic. But that's bullshit. We live in a very unsympathetic society. Why do teachers live in this fantasy world where we all get on and there's no bigotry? That fucking couldn't be further from the truth. And we are not taught about our own disabilities in school, except in subtle ways where we don't realise that we're being taught. For example, studying the curious incident of the dog in the night time for English. We have so much talent, we may have learning disabilities, but we have so much talent, and yet we are told that we can't pass the course. And I think if you're only going to let people that can read and write properly and people that don't have any trouble reading and writing at all, then you are limiting yourself. Your class could be given a lot of value from people that have problems reading and writing. It's just laziness. And teachers have a habit of saying, why can't you be bothered to learn? Well, you can't seem to be bothered to teach us if we have a little bit of trouble, so it works both ways. But of course, in reality, the teachers are a higher authority, and us students, we don't have the power to stand up for ourselves. But that has got to change, and an idea of a good school would be where everyone is included.
Well, when I was at school, I definitely had a hard time being dyslexic and dyspraxic. I feel like it was kind of known what it was, but not really. And there were only like one or two specialists. The vast majority of the teachers knew the term, but not the definition. I think it's kind of difficult to say how inclusive it was as a system, because the system failed, but there was individuals which made the difference. I got through school, I was able to learn to read and write and do the basics, but not due to the machine, but due to one or two individuals who tailored the way they taught me so I would learn in a way which suited my brain type.
My ideal school is a school that is accessible, diverse, a school that reflects the society we want to achieve, that doesn't tell children they cannot succeed here, but asks itself what it needs to do and change to help that student succeed. My ideal school is a school where every student and teacher can walk or roll to class together, a school that prioritises well-being and creativity. My ideal school is well-funded and values all of its staff and pupils' well-being. My ideal school would have an accessible, decolonised, diverse, creative curriculum that teaches critical thinking and politics to all ages to empower students. My ideal school would teach students their rights and how to advocate for themselves and about the many injustices in the world, and it would teach them that they all have value and deserve love, care and respect. My ideal school would teach social responsibility and consent and respect. My ideal school would provide mental health support to all children and teachers rather than waiting for them to suffer. My ideal school would see the value of disabled students. It would teach disability history and culture and allow students to feel pride in that identity through engaging with disabled teachers and mentors. My ideal school is a reflection of my ideal society.
Well, back in my day, it was totally inaccessible because I had a whole series of learning disabilities which were totally undiagnosed. And I recently had this experience of finding my primary school books in my mum's loft, and I was absolutely shocked at what I found, mainly empty pages. I would start a sentence, I'd get a couple of sentences into whatever it was we were supposed to be doing, and then I would just stop, and clearly I was looking out the window, or goodness knows what I was doing, and there was no help of any kind whatsoever. And I can remember maths being a real struggle, and I've got dyscalculia, which has been diagnosed now, but I didn't quite remember how much I was struggling with just writing. And that became really clear. And all the comments from my teachers are things like, "Good start, Sonia, where's the rest?" And it was clearly no attempt to support me with that. It was just like, what is the problem with you? Why are you looking out the window? There was no understanding of a child who could clearly do some things and was able in some ways, but I just wasn't reaching anywhere near my potential. And this carried on into secondary school. Again, absolutely no support. I remember just sitting through subjects like science and maths, and because I was in the lower stream, I had to do something called math science. I wasn't even taught separate science subjects. And I can just remember just sitting there, just glazing over and having to get through the lesson. It was so boring. And nobody ever offered any particular help with that or said, "Why are you struggling? Why can't you do this?" It was just accepted that I would get a bad mark at the end of it, that I don't have a maths qualification to my name. I don't have even the lowest type of maths qualification you could get back in the day. I think it was CSEs. So it was just like, we were just left to get on with it. And I think that was really, really bad.
The school education system is doing so much to be inclusive, with whole departments set up for that. But they can be let down by individual teachers choosing to ignore student statements or resorting to education methods that have been found not to be suitable for those who are neurotypical. I think that socially school can be a very difficult place for someone who thinks and acts differently inherently because of the way that their brain or body works.
I think that schools are definitely more inclusive and accessible today. The education system is so different to how it was even 10 years ago when I was at school. As somebody that works in special educational needs, I see on a daily basis the amazing provision we put in place for these people. I work with autistic individuals on a one-to-one basis. I deliver the secondary education and curriculum to them. And I can honestly say that the facilities now and the things we put in place for these kids is absolutely fantastic compared to how it was before. I mean, we are very fortunate now that we have EdPsychs testing people. We now have diagnosis for things. Years ago, people were just called slow or awfully thick. Now we have labels, we have diagnosis, we have funding, we have facilities, provisions. It has got a lot better. If I take one of our children, for example, they have an educational healthcare plan. They have a list of their needs. They have a key support worker. They have laptops, computers. They have extra support in exams. They get extra time or a room by themselves. They get readers, they get scribers, they even get those pens where it reads out what the question says for anyone that can't read very well. We have come so far. the education system has become more inclusive. My dad's dyslexic. He just got called thick and stupid and went on a naughty table, which I think is awful. I'm dyspraxic. I went through the system and I had a lot of support when I was in secondary school. I had a room by myself because of distractions. I had 25% extra time because I didn't always understand what the question was asking and would need time to take it in. So yeah, we have come really, really far. I think there's more understanding now. People are more educated, for want of a better word, on different learning difficulties, and we're more open to difference. You know, I've worked with children who are blind. I've worked with children who are deaf. The classroom is definitely catered now for a wide range of difference, and that's how it should be. So we have come far 50 years down the line. We are more inclusive. Things are more accessible now in the education system, but I still think we will still move forwards. Obviously, there's always room for improvement, but it is a lot better than what it was. When I think about what our children get, some of our children get support at home. You know, we have outreach agencies coming in. We have people from like CALMS or EdPsych or mental health agencies. You know, each one of our children is supervised with a key support worker. So when they're walking to those mainstream lessons, they have someone to supervise. When they need help with the work, they have a one-to-one. They have an access centre, a unit where they can come because they're autistic, that is facilitated to the max with computers, like I said, voice recorders. There's always someone on hand to help. So I do think it's fantastic the way we've come. And quite frankly, the training sessions are better. I've always believed that newly qualified teachers need to be experienced and need to be taught learning difficulties. You know, years ago, it wasn't part of the teacher training. I'm very grateful that we now live in a more understanding and equal society where difference and difficulties are being celebrated and talked about. You know, these things have to be talked about. How do you educate someone if you don't teach them? You know, people will just remain ignorant if people aren't aware of the best way to support. So absolutely, we've come far. I think we could go a bit further maybe to incorporate even a bit more, whether that's different difficulties as well or more medical difficulties. But we are definitely becoming now more inclusive as schools in England.
My ideal school, starting from primary but going through to secondary, would be lots of physical education, but not horrible sports, just a chance to move around in ways that you enjoy. So lots of different options of what to do, not all doing the same thing. I think it'd be fantastic to have visitors coming in a lot. So artists, scientists, poets, to just give you an idea of lots of different ways of thinking and working. And I think that would be really inspiring and exciting rather than boring. I found so much of my school boring that I would like to have things which actually excite children, and the chance to do sort of experiments and lots of hands-on stuff and learning by making. I think that would be my preferred environment, where you could follow your own interests as well. So quite Montessori and child-led.
I don't think schools are that accessible. Better than they were, but I still think kids with hidden disabilities fall through the cracks. I wasn't diagnosed as autistic until long after I left school. They weren't looking for it. As long as my grades were good, they didn't care about my obvious social problems. And it set me up for a life of isolation and mental illness. I still see this happening today. My friends got little girls and it's like nothing's changed. Like, teachers see a square peg in a round hole, and rather than helping you find the right hole, they just smash away at it until it fits.
A perfect school. What would be a perfect school for me if I was young back then? A perfect school would be a place that opens for new dreams to happen. Somewhere that gives you fire in your belly and makes you want to learn. A safe space to move forward and follow dreams. Don't let other people hold you back. If you want something really desperate, then you gotta go for it. Period.
We have come a long way in 50 years, as we see that disability is more talked about and more represented within different sectors. And obviously education has been part of leading that change. However, there is still nowhere near enough representation, and education still needs to play a vital role in educating peers, professionals and students to feel empowered. In an ideal world, we would be free from labels and misconceptions, and education would be the system to change that, celebrate diversity in all of its wonderful forms. I hope that in 10 years' time, students aren't being asked how dyslexic they are or being called for their exams first to go in a separate room. Being made to feel different is not okay. Being different is great, but being made to feel different is not okay.
Our experience of SEN in schools was very mixed. It completely depended on the support and the SEN teacher. My absolute nightmare was when my daughter would ask a teacher for an explanation because she didn't understand, and rather than explaining in a different format, they would say to my daughter, "Oh, you've not been listening." Well, she was listening, but she was asking a question because she didn't understand the way you'd explained it. I think children who are on any spectrum, whether it be dyslexia, dyscalculia, dyspraxia, are at a disadvantage, especially when you come to exams, because the way the exams are set out, they rely very much on memory, and children with those cognitive processing will have a problem retaining information. I think exams should be brought back where part of the exam is based on your evidence of your work over the past 2 years, and then some of it on actually doing an exam. Generally, SEN, I think, needs to be improved. I think children are at a disadvantage, and especially children where maybe they don't have the support network at home, and also parents who then can't afford to have the children assessed, so they have an evidence document, because any child has to be assessed, but that isn't covered. Parents have to pay for that themselves, and it's very expensive. So generally, things need to be improved. Children are at a disadvantage and they fall through the cracks.
For the question, what does your ideal school look like? I chose my top 3 things. So number 1 is less focus on exams. Students spend so many years learning for it to be judged on a 2-hour or less exam. I always found the pressure of exams quite difficult at school, knowing that that short amount of time would determine your grade forever. Instead, I think there should be more of a focus on coursework. This allows for more time to learn and produce your best work. It reflects the time that you've dedicated to school in a better way than sitting a short exam. At school, I chose coursework-based subjects as I knew it was how I produced my best work. Coursework-based subjects also tend to be more creative, which is what I always found most interesting. From what I hear now, schools are replacing coursework with exams, and I really think this alienates a good percentage of students. Number 2, the arts and vocational subjects should be valued at the same level as maths, English, science, etc. In order to hit targets, schools put too much pressure on the core 3 subjects of maths, English and science. However, this means that people like me who wanted a career in the arts were allocated less time to learn about the things that they truly found interesting. Everyone has different interests and futures, and the curriculum should reflect that. The arts are also proven to be excellent for people's mental health, and I believe that this should be taken just as seriously as good grades. If there were to be a fairer divide of subjects, then there would, as a result, be more support for students who want a career in the arts or media or to be an actress. Too often students, including myself, are told that there are no career options in the arts. Instead, there should be an encouragement to apply your creativity to your career. Number 3, nicer buildings to learn in. This may seem like a silly one, but I really believe that people excel in nicer environments. Students should also be included in what their schools look like. This should reflect their personalities and make them proud to be there. They spend so much time. No one wants to learn in an old, uncomfortable building.
I don't believe that school was ever designed to be inclusive. It makes a nod to it now, but how can it be inclusive? It doesn't include diversity within its staff. So how can there be empathy within the system for those who don't fit into the normal straitjacket of education? Here we are 50 years after this legislation, and we find over 50% of young offenders are dyslexics. We find that somewhere around 20% of dyslexics are identified by the age of 18, leaving the other 80% unaware of who they are, of how they can be helped, how they can help themselves. For me, school should be a reflection of its students. The diversity of individuals who go to school should be represented by the teaching staff themselves. This isn't the case. There should be time for conversation, for debate, for diversity of thought and deed. How can this happen? Classes need to be groups of 10, not 30. Teachers need to be dyslexic. They need to be autistic. They need to be from the community they feed into. They should not be made up of those who do not or cannot empathise with another person's position.
My ideal school would be smaller, more child-focused, and also have different tracks so that you're not all being forced to learn this one rigid curriculum. And it would value vocational and creative education much higher than we do now. I just think that the national curriculum at the moment, it doesn't give kids space to grow. And I'd want a school where kids are taught that their worth is more than just grades. That it's just as important to be kind and hardworking and curious and generous with each other. And when I was at school, I was told that my entire worth was in my grades, and if I didn't get a perfect score, it was the end of the world. Everyone was disappointed in me and I was nothing. I never had space to ask what I actually wanted to do with my life. It was always about fitting in and pleasing other people. I'd like schools to be less focused on their rankings and what they look like to the outside world, and more about the emotional well-being of the children.
I went to a special needs school. It was a school for people with moderate learning difficulties at the time, although I believe now it's sort of transitioned into more of an SLD and MLD kind of thing. I guess one moment which epitomizes my experience with this institution was an instance in which I was encouraged to do some career consultancy with one of the people that worked there. It wasn't really an official professional kind of career consultancy. It was a bit slapdash, to be perfectly honest with you. And essentially, the job I was given that would be good for me was either being a hairdresser, or, because some people thought that was shooting a little bit too high for me, to be the person who sweeps up hair. Now, I'm currently an academic and artist who's doing a doctoral thesis, and as good as I feel that I've somewhat overperformed, let's say, it doesn't make me feel very good for all of the other kids who got told something like that and were convinced that they wouldn't be able to do anything better than that. And I think we've lost a lot of potential because of this.
When I was very young and I was diagnosed with severe dyslexia, the specialist told my mum that I would never cope in a mainstream school and would have to attend a segregated special educational needs institution. I was very privileged to have access to a small private primary school, and in reaction to this, my headmistress employed specialist dyslexia teachers to work with me on a one-to-one basis so I could stay in her school. I actually went on to study English literature to master's level, which no one ever thought would be possible. I still struggled to read and write, but with the start I had and the tools I was given, I had so many more higher education options. Ironically, considering I went to private primary school and how much that helped me, I actually think that private schools should be abolished, because I think all students should have access to small classrooms and personalised learning plans. As a teaching assistant, I have seen what access, resources and decent funding can do for schools. I worked in a special educational needs school for a short time. In the middle of the school was a big hall where we had assemblies and other activities, and around the edge of the hall was a large ramp going up the level of 2 flights of stairs. This ramp allowed all the students and teachers to walk or roll to their classrooms together. All of the toilets were accessible. There were sensory spaces and small outdoor spaces off of each classroom, as well as a large playground with accessible play equipment and a sensory indoor swimming pool. The facilities were incredible. But this is what we should have in all schools, rather than segregating students with disabilities. If we're not creating schools for all children to learn together with equal opportunities, how can we expect to build societies for all? If we are hiding away disabled students and telling them they will not succeed with everyone else, we're telling them that they're the problem, rather than acknowledging that the problem is a society that does not prioritise their access.
I think there were many changes in the early 2000s which began to make education more accessible, but I don't think an understanding of the social model of disability has ever been embedded in education and in the education system, which has held back a true equality for disabled students. Now I find it so upsetting that parents, very understandably, would send their disabled child to a segregated school and not a mainstream school, as the only way they can be sure their child will get some sort of support and not be bullied. My ideal school would reflect an ideal society where there would be true equality.
Integration is founded on the deficit model, with emphasis placed upon the child to change to fit the system, whereas inclusion looks systemically for change that accommodates the child. This important distinction is still a source of contention and highlighted by the lack of consensus and definition. It is clear that all descriptions of inclusion share the same goal, of removing exclusion. However, the exact definition continues to be debated. Some acknowledge there is no single definition of inclusion, but believe one commonality is that children with and without disabilities be placed in the same setting. In 2001, the DFES offered a definition which responded to changes in the law that strengthened students' rights to mainstream education. They said schools supported by local education authorities and others should actively seek to remove the barriers to learning and participation that can hinder or exclude pupils with special educational needs. However, the narrowly focused definition failed to harness the potential and possibility of pursuing holistic cultural change at a systemic level.
My ideal school would look completely different to what we have today. It would be tailored for everyone's learning styles. It wouldn't have sets or classes. They wouldn't make you learn the maths, English, science. You would have a basic understanding, sure, but it would create experts. It would allow you to follow your passion and allow that passion to change over time. It would teach you to think and not to remember. It would praise people for having unique ways of solving problems. In my ideal school, things like dyslexia and dyspraxia and other learning conditions wouldn't be seen as a negative. It'd be seen as a vital part of teams that are able to solve complex problems.
I went to a Catholic school and I don't think there was much provision for anybody with other needs, additional needs, support, learning support. We never had any learning assistance in the classroom. Nobody was on one-to-one. I certainly wish I'd been picked up and that there'd been some awareness of cognitive difference back then, but there wasn't really. I'm not sure how much things have changed. I think certainly, like with my nephews, they've been to nursery in the first school and they're just about to start going to school, and I think it's a little bit better. Like one of them's got talking issues, verbal issues, and he's getting support, and they've got a package of care and making sure that they've got like an educational plan. And so now that I know all about these things, and I think that's really positive, and that it's all about integration and dealing with and coping with differences in the classroom and not separating people out. Although I know that that's not the case, and it's very school by school basis, and that some schools, like I also know somebody who has a child who is autistic and mental health needs and can't access school, and yet they've just been left to flounder. He's 10 and should be getting some kind of educational provision but isn't. Not in the hospital, not in the school, and it's kind of one size fits all, and either you can make it to school and cope with the system or you can't and you get left behind. And I think it's all a bit of a lottery. It's not fair that just because of where you live or your postcode that limits your degree of educational success, which impacts on the rest of life about opportunities and how they present themselves or the kind of things that you can access. And of course, I've grown up with access to a lot more varied schooling like Steiner and Montessori, and how they are much more inclusive and also not so rigid in their teachings and more adaptive to the children's needs. And also, having been like an artist going into school, it's like, you know, you get, oh, watch out for Johnny because he's like this, and actually because you're not doing things in the traditional way, and it allows other people to kind of access learning in a different method that maybe allows them to shine. I think it all just smacks of the machine and putting them through the system, and the individuals get lost. Not always, but generally, and I think that system needs to change.
My experiences of special school education start when I got kicked out of mainstream, funny enough, back in 1978. For a few months, I was just in a remedial room on my own, tried to learn. I was bullied at mainstream education. And then I ended up in special needs for handicapped children, as it was then. I did enjoy it first because I wasn't being bullied, and in a strange way, I became bully myself because I came from a background where I was a bit more streetwise than anyone else. But my big issue is still with segregated education, or like special needs, whatever term you choose to use, is that people are still not given a right for like exams. ASDAN is nowhere near a GCSE level. I grew up in the 70s, matured in the 80s, and throughout the 80s, I didn't have any work because I had no qualifications. In the 90s, I did a degree. I'm degree educated, but my son still thinks it's bizarre I haven't got any GCSEs. He's just doing A-levels at the moment, but a couple of years back when he started his GCSEs, he asked me what GCSEs I got, and I said nothing. And he was gobsmacked by that. For last 16 years, I've been involved in disability rights, and I've come in contact with a lot of young disabled people because I was a youth worker, and it's still amazing, a lack of an education for any young disabled person, especially if you're not in the mainstream setting. And there's still lots that are not in the mainstream setting. I used to put, when I first applied for jobs, my school, and I would put special schooling, and I never got any interviews, never. And I stopped doing that, and I got interviews, but still try to negotiate people's biases, like people's stereotypes. As a disabled person, I would encourage anyone who went to segregated education to look at their school records, because you can still get them through a subject access request. I've got my school records, and for many years I was classed as highly strung. Now, whatever that means, I don't know. It's just that definition that hangs around with you. There's loads of writing say that people that have attended special school are at least 5 years emotionally behind everybody else. Also, anyone who went to special school knows that sex education wasn't taught in any such form. And I remember when we was reaching 16, the headmaster at the time saying, oh, now you go to leave school and you go to experience things that you haven't done before. And all it consisted was him playing Kings of the Road to us and said, listen to his song and that's all you need to know. And it was bizarre. There's a big lobby of parents' power that says, like, I don't want my child to get bullied and they would be bullied in mainstream, and like, I don't want them, but they don't realise the bigger picture. There's no education, there's no perceived route for a person. It's a parent's views that gets listened to over any young disabled person. And the parents, rightly or wrongly, don't necessarily know what's good, what's best for the individual. They can perceive what's best for the individual, but they don't know. And I'm just amazed that this system is still in place. How many people are in employment that have been through that system? I doubt if anybody could tell you the exact figures, and nobody will say they've gone to special school. People will say they've went to such a university or such a school, but they would never tell you they went to special school. And it's always perceived as not education. We know how shit society is. We feel with that every day. I would like schools to be for everybody, not for like just people that fit the criteria. I'm happy being a disabled person. I'm not happy how other disabled people are treated by society.
I had a very weird school experience. I went into primary and early years and I was mainstreamed for a long time, which was not a great experience for me. I was isolated, I was in a manual wheelchair and I wasn't allowed to touch my own wheels for my chair, which is incredibly disempowering. It's disabling, actually, until I finally decided that I didn't want to be mainstreamed anymore. I was bullied, all that kind of stuff. And the teacher's priority was never about being inclusive or being supportive in any way. And at that time, my mum wrote quite a few letters that I found had been quite interesting. And there's just some really nice things that she said. For example, as a parent, I want to ensure as much as possible that my wheelchair and disability do not become her defining features, me. It's critical that people see beyond the disability to the person. This sometimes requires that faculty and staff be sensitive to times and situations where she is likely to be left out or treated differently, and to be a bit more creative in trying to make sure that it doesn't happen or to minimise the effect if it cannot be avoided. I feel that inclusion problems can come in many forms, and sensitivity and creativity needs to be a feature of the educational process for all children. All children need to feel welcome and included. I just thought that was really nice to hear that she wrote that. That was back in 2002. So I just thought that was quite powerful. Since then, I went to a mainstream school and then I went to a non-mainstream school where I got all the social aspects, but I didn't get much of the educational aspects. But I have since then completed my undergraduate degree and I've completed my master's degree. So that kind of, even though that early experience wasn't inclusive and I felt very isolated, it's complicated to find your way through that. And I know a lot of disabled parents of disabled children, and also disabled parents who find the support system incredibly difficult and hard to access. But my education has really given me the ability to achieve what I want to achieve in life, and that's incredibly important, not just for disabled people, but for any child.
My experience at school was pretty crap. At 9 years old, I still couldn't read, let alone write properly. My parents complained quite a lot to the school. One of the teachers brought in a school psychologist, and so I had to do the tests. And the woman had no eyebrows, because it was really common to shave your eyebrows off in the sort of 60s. And she was showing me these pictures, asking me what's missing, and of course there was a picture of somebody with no eyebrows, but she had no eyebrows. So I felt quite a dilemma about saying, well, there's no eyebrows, but you haven't got any eyebrows either. And that's always stayed with me, that interview with this person to try and find out what's wrong with me, or why aren't I learning particular things in a particular way. And then I got singled out with a few other kids, and we were taken out of our class and sent to the special needs class, as it was called. And we had a teacher who was like the witch out of The Wizard of Oz, because she had a bicycle with a basket at the front. She was called Mrs. Marsh. I mean, she was great because she taught us to read and write, but at the same time there was a lot of stigma with being in the special needs class, and I had stigma already because I'm Jewish, so that didn't help. And then to have stigma on top of that of being in the special needs group, which is what we were called, which was horrible. So the fact that you went to special needs and other people didn't, you were made to feel like you were the thick kids who didn't learn very well. And also it really impacted when you went to secondary school. And dyslexia wasn't recognised as a disability until 1989, and I left in 1985. And my support, and there's good and bad in that. So I didn't get O levels. I got a history O level, and that was about it. I mean, I've got English O level D. I've never passed it, and probably never will, because I don't get certain things. And about the week before my O levels, they said, "Oh, look, you can do it all on tape recorder." I've never ever written an essay on tape recorder, so how a week before my O levels would I suddenly just do that? And also by then I'd also got a diagnosis of clinical depression, which hardly surprising really, because not just did I have dyslexia, but my dad became really ill and had brain cancer and died, and schools weren't really kitted out for that. Plus I'd been expelled from my first secondary school because I didn't wear school uniform and I didn't conform, and I was quite naughty because partly in my first year of my first secondary school they wouldn't let the special needs teacher come to school because they didn't recognise dyslexia, so for a year I didn't get support. Second year they then agreed that they'd let the teacher come in, but in order to be the only child in the school going to a special needs class, you had to be tough, because if you were the thick git, you had to be able to beat everybody else up, basically, and stand up for yourself, and that's hard work. You know, that's really tough. You got picked on and bullied, and I don't know whether education's really dealt with that, and I know there's lots of people fighting for inclusive education. I was in inclusive education as a special needs person and actually suffering quite a lot. But what happened at this other school was I actually managed to get sent to college on day release, and going to college on day release was the best thing going. Didn't have to wear school uniform. Nobody knew what you were doing at FE college, whether you were in special needs or whether you were in a other class. You could join the student union, you could party, you could, do all sorts of things. I think not having uniform and things like that gave you a sense of being able to be adult.
I had the good fortune of going to mainstream schools throughout my life. I think that over the last 50 years, the framework is in place for disabled people like myself to theoretically have a better chance at a good education. The framework should be in place and is in place for disabled people like myself to get the education they need that prepares them for life as an adult, that instills in you that sort of lifelong love of learning, as it should do. But having the framework in place is only one part of the puzzle, and it's got to be put into practice, and it's got to be properly resourced. I feel that whilst the legislation and the regulation is there, I feel that too often it's inaccessible to disabled people. You hear all the time about parents, about individuals having to fight to get the support they need to be able to access the education that they need. I feel like whilst we have made great legislative steps forward, the practical realities are almost moving backwards. If you think about the difficulties that people face when it comes to going to a SEND tribunal without support, the lack of support that's available for families, the difficulty with which people have to fight for an EHCP just so that their child can access education on a level of parity with their peers is almost barbaric. The thing that's always enabled me to access mainstream education hasn't necessarily been the legislation in place or the support that's on offer from the state, but it's been the attitudes of the people around me in schools, by which I mean education professionals. So when I was at primary school, the SENCO, this special educational needs coordinator, she was the one who would drive to my house, pick me up and drive me to school. She didn't have to do that, but we were having such difficulty trying to access support from the local authority to get me to and from the house that the SENCO said, well, this is ridiculous. You're going to be waiting forever to get this approved, if it even is approved. So I will just do this myself. And that's what enabled me to get a primary education. When I was at secondary school, the amazing SENCO from my primary helped us battle with the local authority to make sure that support was in place so that I could then get assistance from the local authority to get from my home to my secondary school. So thankfully, no other teacher had to put up with me at like 7 a.m, being dragged away from the TV to go to school to do something I didn't want to do at the time. But it's only through the attitudes of people that I've been able to access the provisions that should have been in place. I remember the school nominated me for a Jack Petchey Award, and my peers who were receiving one of them had got top marks across the country for his science, GCSE or whatever, and someone else had done some amazing community work. And the reason they'd nominated me was, and I'll never forget like the sheer red embarrassment on my face when they said in a sort of all years assembly, and finally a Jack Petchey Award for me, when they said that I was to receive Jack Petchey Award for being a very pleasant and lovely person. And I thought, God, you just say you just want to give me a Jack Petchey Award because I'm disabled. Like, just be frank about it, you know? Yeah, I remember like just being ridiculed by my peers afterwards because they were like, oh, I wish I got a Jack Petchey Award for being nice. I just remember that just being singled out like that just made me feel so excluded at a time when they were trying to make me feel included. The school was really proud to do other things, like they installed a lift, and they made this big song and dance about how, this for future generations who can access the school. But the irony is I went through selective education for my secondary, so I sat the 11 plus and I passed it, and I got into a non-fee paying grammar school. You're talking about sort of opening up level access for everybody, and yet we're practicing selective education. But that's a wholly different conversation.
Well, I can't talk about the education system right now, but I can talk about my own experience and how that affected my life. Being at school was tough. Some teachers are well educated and have a vision that makes them passionate. This makes them great teachers. But you gotta think big. If you think too small, it's not enough. And learn from that. I nearly wasted 10 years of my life after I left school and college. I don't want to gamble another 10. It was hard for me to go back into mainstream education when I was looking at application form for Central. I was thinking to myself, should I even try for something different, or should I just stay where I am, even though I'm not moving forward?
To begin to understand the origin of inclusion, it is important to consider the term exclusion. For many, exclusion means to be separated from mainstream society because of disability, mental illness, race, religion, beliefs, values, appearance, or poverty, leading to societal divisions. Therefore, policies of social inclusion were offered as a solution to separation and segregation. The idea of inclusion in education has been highly contested nationally and internationally, due in part to the discourses surrounding definition and ownership. The term inclusion has traditionally been used interchangeably with integration. However, the conceptualisation of both terms has different implications for the educational system and the children within it.
Disabled children, disabled young people very often lack a variety of significant external role models of disabled people. When you're going through education, examples are everything. They clarify context and reinforce a sense of real meaning. And of course, it is difficult to be able to readily cite role models who are disabled people out and around in society, unless they are people who very often have achieved, incredible things against incredible odds. And there's a kind of imbalance in relentlessly using those kind of role models as examples in education and other settings, as tends to happen in the media. I think that's just one very small example of how marginalised and disabled young people and children can be disadvantaged in those settings. Just that flow across from the outer real world, outer society into education, and things like that can chip away at people's confidence, and it can contribute to that sense of isolation during education. Standing back a little bit, there's probably something to be said about looking at all the positive things disabled people can contribute to education. And I don't just mean popping up as role models, I mean as educators and people making a powerful and positive influence on all children and young people, not just young disabled people. A very obvious point is the education sector is a highly disrupted sector, and we do see huge numbers of young people leaving school with poor rates of literacy and increasingly high levels of stress, living with high degrees and high levels of competition around them, but with low prospects. So this kind of discordance, this mismatch, is part of the landscape. And the point here being that the disabled young people are very much in the front line or the firing line of all of this. And where perhaps wider forms of support, a variety of agencies that could target different kinds of support for disabled young people as they were due to transition out of education, of course, have been so greatly depleted that sense of not just muddle about what they've been through, but fear perhaps about what lies ahead, is a hugely corrosive and undermining influence, I think, in a young life. And we see, the negative ripples of all of this reflected in an educational workforce that's seriously undermined as far as its morale and its capability of retaining and recruiting staff is concerned. Probably there's lots of good intentions in around supporting disabled people in education, but looking at higher education settings, for example, I think some of the mismatches and disparities that you see there is a very strong adherence to a kind of medical model of disability, fixing the individual rather than looking perhaps at institutional barriers that can be moved. And the greater concern is for the disabled people who don't even get into higher education. They are the absent people in this discussion, I think, in many ways.
Definitions that go further and encompass all learners as opposed to particular groups may be more constructive with respect to the future of inclusion. As such, the definition offered by the Centre for Studies into Inclusive Education may offer a more progressive construct to aid change. They say that inclusion means enabling all students to participate fully in the life and work of mainstream settings, whatever their needs. Inclusion also is seen as a continuing process of breaking down barriers to learning and participation for all children and young people. In a social model of education, the individual is valued and not faulty. Diagnosis is replaced by needs-driven intervention, drawing on strengths. Relationships are nurtured. Solution-orientated identification of barriers reduces labelling. Diversity is welcomed, removing the perception of normal as an entry requirement, and training prevents segregation with high-quality teaching at the forefront. I believe in this type of thinking and feel that it would allow society to evolve in dissolving power within educational settings. Are we there yet? Well, when you look at the growing reliance upon zero-tolerance behaviour management, where all individuals are homogeneously judged against the same set of behavioural standards, and children are placed in isolation for hours, it is difficult to argue that we have reached a point where education is truly inclusive.
Over the last 40 years in education, schools have become incredibly more inclusive. But sometimes within the education plans at the moment, they still try to move children out of primary schools. As they say that a special school will be better and do better provision. But sometimes maybe if they had a one-to-one support from an adult within school, they could stay or work with adults who have been through the education system. And many of them went to special schools where the provision is different, where the curriculum is different, where they have a better range of activities, which takes them away from national curriculum and expectations of being able to achieve. In a very strange world, 40 years ago, when we started teaching, all children were equal. I never heard of autism or a child with behavioural needs. You treated all your class as you wanted them to treat each other, and you taught them in groups and you gave group activities. But actually, we just used to say, where did all the autistic children come from? Where did all the children with behaviour problems come from? Because actually, in the past, we absolutely were inclusive and just included them and just got on with our jobs, which is really an interesting fact, I suppose. I still think mainstream education, especially primary, could try to keep children rather than saying that their needs cannot be met and they need special support in a specialist school.
My ideal school would be a school where everyone is accepted and there aren't labels saying you're disabled, you're not. And we're not segregating from each other. We all learn from each other. Because if you segregate people with disabilities and people without disabilities, then nobody will learn from each other. My ideal school would be where it is compulsory to learn about learning disabilities and compulsory to learn about any marginalised groups. It's compulsory that we learn about all sorts of discrimination and that we do not sugarcoat it and that we learn from history and not repeat it, unlike what the fucking government is doing, which is exactly what they're doing, repeating bad history. It is important that we learn that as disabled people we are oppressed and that we suffered a lot in times of oppression. It is important that we learn that as disabled people our human rights are being taken away. That is my ideal school, and a school where we celebrate people's differences, but we also remember the struggles that it took in order for all our differences to be celebrated. It's important that we celebrate, but we don't sugarcoat all the shit we had to go through to get where we are now. And our journey is still far from over. And a good school would be where teachers, if somebody is behaving badly, we are given the benefit of doubt and we are asked, why are you behaving that? Whilst then, oh, you're behaving that way, you're bad, you are a bad person. We should learn why we are how we are.
I couldn't really tell you what an ideal school would look like. An ideal school could only exist in an ideal world. An ideal school would represent the area that it existed in. It would support the students that needed it. But, it has to represent the staff and the pupils. It doesn't matter what a building is, as long as it's physically accessible, when nothing is done to make the people accessible.
When I was at infant school in the 1990s, my desk was taken away from me and I had to share with my teacher until they felt my handwriting had improved. My teacher held my hand whilst I wrote.